Thank you very much for joining us today. We're really excited to talk to you about revenue management. I'm going to introduce our panel in a few seconds here, but wherever you are in the world, thank you for joining us. Thank you for taking the time, to either be a Guesty user or looking into Guesty. And so let's kick things off. A little bit about me. My name is Paul Zukowskis. I'm the VP of Global Customer Success here at Guesty. Been with the company now almost exactly 3 years. I think June 24th will be my 3-year mark. I've had the distinguished pleasure of actually talking to a number of our marketplace partners, as well as a lot of our PMC clients from all over the globe. And I've really loved every minute of working at Guesty and working with all of you. Today on our panel, we're joined by John Flanagan, the VP of Sales from Transparent. John was just telling us that he's got a 2-month-year-old baby at home. So congratulations, John, for that. We're also joined by John Deroulet, a revenue manager expert from Wheelhouse. For those that don't know, John is a prominent oil painter, as I learned from the VRMA Chicago event. And then also we're joined by one of our PMC clients, Robert Schweizer, the CEO of Horseshoe Bay Living. Horseshoe Bay, if you haven't checked it out, do so after this webinar. Amazing listings in the Texas area. And so Rob's got a lot of really great insights to share about kind of how they're managing their revenue. So a little bit about today's agenda. I'll open up with a few key kind of stats and what we're seeing on the Guesty's end, and then talk a little bit about revenue management. Then we'll hear from our distinguished panelists, and then we'll get into a little bit of a panel discussion. All right. So the one thing that that everyone has on their mind is kind of what are we seeing in the summer season? What are we seeing over the July 4th holiday? I think when we're looking out, we see that as the next primary holiday here in the United States. And we are seeing reservation volumes increase over the July 4th holiday, greater than they were in 2021, but actually still a little bit lower than where we were in 2019 by 10%. Despite kind of that lower reservation volume and the slightly lower occupancy, we are seeing that the average nightly rates are still sustaining to be relatively high. And so they're 12% greater than they were in 2021, and then 35% greater than they were in 2019. And we have a question lined up specifically about occupancy and reservation volumes for our panel. And so we'll be sure to kind of address what they're seeing from the Transparent, from the Wheelhouse side, and then also with John, and what Robert is experiencing from his end with Horseshoe Bay. All right, so it's not just the Americas that's actually kind of heating up a little bit in terms of reservation volumes. We're also noticing increased higher reservation volumes in the UK as well as in Australia. We know it's the Australian winter, but Australia really is performing unseasonably high for itself. It's 37% higher than it was in 2019. And then the UK is 51% higher than it was last year, but still a little bit lower than where it was in 2019. So beyond just the UK and Australia, what are we seeing kind of throughout the entire EMEA European region? Spain and Greece are seeing drastic increases in reservation volume of 51% in Spain and 58% in Greece, higher than where they were in 2019. Portugal and France are seeing moderate increases, France at a 5% higher in 2019 and Portugal at 14% higher than it was in 2019, with Italy actually being the only major European market that we're kind of tracking today that's down from its 2019 numbers, almost 15% down. All right, so that's a little bit about kind of what we're seeing in terms of reservation volumes and occupancy. Now to talk about kind of, the crux of why we're all here, which is the revenue management. And so the way that Guesty kind of sees its revenue management, it sees it as a pyramid, right? And on the base of that pyramid, we see the base price. And so if all you're doing is setting your base price, then you're in the correct webinar today, because chances are that you're probably leaving a lot of additional revenue and unbooked nights on the table. And so once you start working up from your base price, you get into rate strategy. And this is really where you can go one of two directions. In Guesty's marketplace, we offer a number of dynamic pricing partners, whether it's Beyond, Price Labs, Wheelhouse, and others. And so there are a lot of dynamic pricing options for you. What dynamic pricing does is it leverages algorithms to kind of determine the supply and demand in your area and ensuring that you're trying to maximize your revenue while also maximizing your occupancy. If dynamic pricing isn't necessarily needed in your market, you can use revenue management strategies. And this is something that we have inherently in Guesty, in which if you understand your current markets and you can set specific hard rules, so it won't be dynamically changing, but hard rules that will either increase or decrease rates based on weekends or weekdays. If you know certain holiday seasons to be very high, you can set hard rules around 5 days leading up to Christmas, 5 days after Christmas, 5 days leading up to the new year, 5 days after the new year. And so you can use these very kind of rigid type of rule structures if you understand your market to kind of determine your pricing fluctuations. After that, we have rate plans. And so rate plans really are based on some of the characteristics of the reservation that the guest prefers. You could either increase or decrease your rate based on that plan. So if someone is looking for a flexible cancellation policy, then chances are that you're going to increase your rate to accommodate that flexible cancellation policy. And so that would be an example of a rate plan. And then lastly, but not least, is the discounts, promotions, and coupons. And so when leveraged with your marketing organization, promotions, coupons, and discounts can be very valuable tools for you to kind of fill some of those gap nights, or to draw in a different audience or create a new marketing segment or guest segment for you. And so being creative with these promotions and coupons can really help drive increased revenues for you. So first up, we have John from Transparent that will talk about kind of the larger kind of data that they're seeing on reservations and revenue management, and how to best kind of apply revenue management strategies to your listings.
Wonderful. Well, hello, everyone. My name is John Flanagan. I'm the Vice President of Sales at Transparent. We're a hospitality data analytics company focused on short-term rentals. And guys, I've got a small surprise for you today. For those of you in attendance here live, and everyone who's going to be watching this recording, you're actually the first public audience that's going to get a glimpse into the strategic direction of Transparent moving forward after our acquisition by OTA Insight, which is catering to the convergence of hotel and short-term rental data provisioning. I'm going to share some information with you about both of these main hospitality sectors and introduce some ideas that how this might matter to you now and in the future. So the first part of today's presentation is going to primarily focus on concepts. Knowing that 43% of you are hesitant, I hope that this content is actually really helpful for you to learn about how others like Robert are using this to their advantage already today. We'll share some data, of course, but throughout, I'd like you to ask yourself if you have visibility to the things we're going to discuss in your market or markets today. At the end, we'll summarize with 5 trends that you could be taking into consideration. So without further ado, let's jump into some persisting trends. Concept. Global demand is all over the place. On this chart, the 0 line is average demand for 2019. Each of the squiggly lines represents the sporadic changes in this demand quarter over quarter and year over year since, broken down by regions of the world. Sometimes with data, it's best to start big and then go small. So while we're looking at global market fluctuations through the pandemic here, in general, the most effective revenue managers in our space have had to figure out a way to adapt to trends in their specific market or markets at any given time, and basically in real time. So let's dive into some different markets and look at this deeper. Concept. On the books data versus previous years can be a great indicator of future activity. And historically, we've used this data to help steer actions for the present and future. But now more than ever, historical data is less relevant than before. So what are we looking at here? The dark blue bars are summer 2019 on the books. And then the thin light blue bars are 2022 on the books for summer months. If you have really good eyes, you may also notice that we're comparing hotels and short-term rentals side by side here. In most cases, short-term rentals are outperforming hotels in 2022, but that's not true across all markets. So of these examples, hotels were outperforming short-term rentals in Los Angeles in 2019 and still are today. The point is while it's important to be aware of macro trends, it's important, more important even, for revenue managers and property management companies to understand what's happening in your market right now and moving forward. So for another example from these charts, Miami Beach has been flipped on its head since 2019 for hotels. So short-term rentals are booming in that market for this summer. And what that means is that historical trends are not accurate for the Miami Beach market right now. So if I'm a property manager in Miami Beach, it's crucial that I consider current and forward-looking data as my primary indicators versus historical. Next, concepts. Pacing charts help you drive your base rates. We've got three markets on the charts on the right: Mallorca, Destin, and Athens. The dark blue line is current week 2021, and the green line is current week 2022. The takeaway is that trends are market specific, not industry specific. Mallorca, for example, is pacing way ahead of 2021. Destin's slightly behind 2021, and Athens they started booking up a little earlier, but it's pretty consistent. If I'm in Mallorca and I'm not raising my rates to capitalize on this accelerated pacing, I'm probably leaving money on the table. Concept. Monitor your booking window throughout the year. Let me just ask you guys directly here. Do you know what your booking window is? Do you know what the average booking window is in your market? Across the cities on the chart, it ranges from 40 to 60 days. Chamonix in France is at the far right, signaling the largest booking window on the chart, whereas San Diego is on the far left, signaling the smallest. So maybe if I know my booking window is shorter, perhaps I'm less reactive to pacing data, and I give travelers a little bit more time to book before I start to cut rates. Let's move on into ADR. Concepts. Be cognizant of your comp sets when you use ADR as a data point. You want to drill down whenever you can. This chart of global ADR for all 2 bedrooms is not actionable for you. It's cool to know. It tells you that in general, everything is more expensive by about 24%. But to make this type of analysis actionable for you, don't just look at ADR. Look at ADR filtered by different factors. Where might you go from here? So do you filter by rural versus urban? Do you filter by specific amenity or amenities? Do you filter by average review score or even review count? Do you filter by specific competitors in your market or even specific listings? How do you use this insight in combination with a dynamic pricing tool like Wheelhouse that you may already be using to make better decisions for revenue management overall? Concept. Consider market type in your comp sets. On the graph, which is showing the evolution of global proportion of vacation rental reservations by market type, urban is red, ski is blue, rural is green, and then beach and lake is yellow. My takeaway is that urban markets seem to be picking up some steam, but they're not quite back to where they were in 2019 and pre-pandemic 2020. I was just in Colorado Springs last week. For example, I spent one night in Colorado Springs and then 4 nights up in the mountains in a small town called Black Hawk, which is phenomenal. For any of you who have not explored that, you certainly should. Those experiences were completely different. The nightly rates for everything we looked at in the mountains were different. They're higher than what we looked at in the city. I feel that's appropriate. My question to you is, do you consider this today in your strategy? Concept. Traveler origin should impact your marketing strategies. Do you know what percentage of your guests are domestic travelers? Okay, for the US as a whole, 80% is domestic versus 53% in Mexico, for example. But do you know what yours is? And that begs another question. Do you have different marketing strategies based on purchasing power of your different demographics? Let's look at a specific example here. So the concept is, if you know that you get a lot of foreign travelers in a certain time of the year, does that impact your rates? And so this is just an example, but for Portugal, month over month, travelers come from different companies. Spain is green. So this tells us that the Spanish love to go to Portugal in December, for example. So let's look at this from a different angle. So the concept is that spending power varies by guest origin. So we got 2 charts, the US on the left, Spain on the right. The turquoise bars represent domestic travelers. So to be clear, this is just money spent on the accommodations, doesn't include flights or travel costs or anything like that. But the takeaway for the US is that the British spend more on average for accommodations in the US than any other country. If you're a PMC in the US and you know you have approximately X number of guests from the UK every year, and that those guests spend more money than any other guest, maybe you design some specific marketing campaigns around those guests to entice them to book with you again in the future. And actually, the British spend more in Spain than everybody else too. But more importantly, they spend more than double what a domestic traveler in Spain would spend. Interesting stuff. Concepts. Event-based revenue management is absolutely key now, and I think inevitably moving forward. In this example, rates in Qatar are 800% higher, 800% higher than 2019 because of the World Cup. There's a lot more here to digest from this slide, but in the interest of time, the point is that events can present a huge revenue opportunity, and data will help you understand just how big that opportunity is. Concept is that automated dynamic pricing is not a competitive differentiator anymore in and of itself. This is not a shot at Wheelhouse. You should be using a tool like Wheelhouse. But based on one of the surveys that Transparent did recently, over 75% of the professional market will be using a dynamic pricing tool in the near future. Data helps you optimize the way you leverage those amazing dynamic pricing tools like Wheelhouse that are on the market today. Again, from a Transparent survey, or from Transparent survey data, companies who invest in data from Transparent or one of its competitors, who are also very good, see a 26% growth in revenue versus only 5% for those not investing in data. So we're almost done, folks, with my stuff. So let's rapid fire 5 trends that you should take into consideration as you continue on your revenue management journey. Number 1, while ad hoc events and general market evolution have always justified current and forward-looking data, the volatility of demand and market conditions during the pandemic fueled the attention towards this kind of visibility. Property managers have had to adapt to unpredictable fluctuation during the pandemic, and data gave that visibility. Now, in recovery, demand is reshaped and historical data has been rendered more obsolete. Property managers now have access to real-time looks at the next 365 days of demand and rates, giving visibility to adapt their strategies and navigate trends optimally for the future. Number 2, revenue management is more granular now. So let's take an advanced approach using pacing data and forward-looking on the books data versus outdated strategies of just fill up your place and use dynamic pricing to save time. It's more complicated than that now. It's not a dynamic pricing or database revenue management. It's dynamic pricing and database revenue management. This you may recognize is the example from one of our previous slides showing Mallorca. And so the Mallorca PMCs have been able to capitalize on increased demand. If they were just looking historical, they would have missed out on this. Number 3, based on Transparent survey data, 50% of US PMCs now update their rates daily, whereas only 19% did so in 2019. The point is that this is a full-time job, a full-time role, and it's a necessity. Number 4, you want to get granular with your comp sets. While broad segmentation used to be sufficient, getting granular and being specific is now certainly the way to go. Number 5, 86% of professional property managers with over 50 properties purchase and utilize data. Of those, 11% spend more than $10,000 a year on data alone. Guys, the data is there. You got to use it. So if any of this has been helpful today, and to everyone here, from all of us at Transparent, thank you so much for being here. And again, a huge thanks to Guesty for hosting this event and choosing to include us. If you'd like to get in touch with us or learn more about what data can do for you, scan the QR code on the screen, check out our website, ctransparent.com. You can always reach me directly at john@ctransparent.com. Thank you very much, and cheers.
Excellent. Thank you very much, John, for all of that information. That's really great. And thank you for partnering with Guesty as well.
Absolutely.
I had a question for you. Essentially, you're communicating historical data. It's good to keep in mind, but more or less you can't rely on it anymore because of kind of pandemic and post-pandemic conditions.
Not in and of itself. That's right.
Do you ever foresee, looking through a crystal ball, how many years out from this pandemic do we have to be where we can go back to actually relying on historical data, or is that a thing of the past in and of itself?
Yeah, I do think historical data trends can still be helpful. I think that when you have a pandemic that throws everything on its head like we've had, we're going to have a period here of 2 or 3 years where people start to ignore 2019, 2020, maybe even 2021, and they start to look at, let's look at 2022 through 2025 as our historical comp set to observe trends. And I think the macro stuff, looking at, how has a single market grown from 2018 to 2028 can be interesting at scale, but for revenue management purposes, I think that we're probably a couple of years out from historical data being truly indicative of what you should do moving forward.
Yeah. I tend to agree with you. Even when I was presenting our data earlier today, it was, this is what we saw in 2021, this is what we saw in 2019, and we make no mention of the year 2020 when we're benchmarking anything. So you're probably right. You're probably looking out to 2025 until you could actually start referencing any kind of meaningful historical comp set following the pandemic. So thank you, John, again, for that wealth of information. All right, moving on to the other John now from Wheelhouse.
Great data, John. And Paul at the beginning. I think a lot of us are starting to hear some really interesting things in the marketplace, particularly in the United States. Some of it may be causing people a little stress. We're seeing, lower occupancies, maybe some headwinds coming. There's a lot of macroeconomic news that causing people some fear. But there's some counter news too. Rates are remaining extremely high. RevPAR really hasn't been affected yet, maybe causing people not to panic. Can you guys see my screen, by the way?
Yes. You're looking good.
And what's, I think as a revenue manager, both of those viewpoints are probably true. There's some things to be very concerned about, which makes us want to think about how our revenue strategy is going to be in the future. But that means there's also opportunities too, especially when occupancy is down and rates are really high. As a revenue manager, there's some opportunities. So what a revenue manager really needs to do is figure out how to find where and when they might make changes. That's the complicated thing. We talk a lot about data, but how do you get from that data to actual decisions that you can use in your portfolio? And that's what I want to talk to you guys about today. I'm going to present 3 techniques. These aren't the only 3 techniques that you can use, but they're just 3 kind of overviews of techniques you can use to take data that you're looking at and get to actual pricing decisions on your portfolio. How does that affect your rate strategy? So this first one is going to be using market trends and maybe competitive sets to determine how you're going to adjust things in your portfolio. Usually you're going to need a platform to do that. So using Transparent's great platform. There's also companies like AirDNA, Key Data, the revenue management companies as well sometimes provide certain kinds of data to help influence this decision making. And essentially what you're going to do when you pull this data is look at a little bit of broader trends. And you're going to choose your key KPIs like occupancy, ADR, maybe revenue on a forward looking. And you want to compare that to what is going on in your portfolio. So if you're looking at monthly occupancies across the board, you want to say, hey, it looks like from year to year, this is an example of occupancies over here in this graph. This month is up year over year. Is my portfolio up year over year? And should it be? And what you're trying to do is make these comparisons that let you go to your own portfolio and say, okay, if I'm down, maybe I should lower the rate. If I'm up, maybe I should increase the rate further. And you draw these comparisons between what you see either year over year or between segments of the portfolio and try to extrapolate them to your own portfolio. So it's all a comparison between market KPIs and your KPIs. As you get more granular using this kind of method of market data, usually you want to bring it down to a smaller level of detail. So compare, go from monthly, compare weekly or daily, compare things like pace, more advanced KPIs, your own benchmarking of your historicals against what's going on in the market. You can also compare different kinds of units within your portfolio that are all grouped together. All my 4-bedroom homes, all my luxury homes, how does that compare to this subset of the market data? And you use that to try to get to answers about your, what you should do on a daily basis about your rates. The next one I want to talk about is I usually call it assumption-based kind of revenue management practices. Another way to put it is budget-based, although not everyone will be using a budget. And I think, we talk about revenue management being a very complex kind of technical field, but there's a lot of intuition in here. And I know a lot of entrepreneurs themselves are doing this on an intuitive level. So when you're going to build assumptions about your portfolio, those might look like 60 days away, I want to be 60% occupied. And 30 days away, I want to be 80% occupied. I'm sure if I could see your hands, you know someone who does that, or you've said that yourself. Those are what you're doing is you're building benchmarks for yourself so you know when to be concerned about your portfolio. You can use your own internal KPIs like occupancy and ADR and potentially other historical information and build these out into maybe a document that tracks your assumptions about where you should be, automatically puts your KPIs into it, and highlights the areas that you need to look so you know where on your calendar to look or when to make changes, either rate up or down, restrictions up or down, other more granular things. Now, as you establish these benchmarks and get more sophisticated and are able to track against them, you can start to fine tune them. Maybe you have a different set of rules for each season, because I saw someone in the chat mention their booking windows were different in each season. And that's a good marker. We know booking window is maybe a driver of your portfolio. You may have different ideas of how occupied you should be or what your rate should be at any given time based on those. And you can kind of build those out to get more granular. You can start bringing it to the day of the week level. Something I always recommend you do is organize your portfolio into certain property groups that you can use to track data against, because it's very hard to look at 150 different assumptions. But if you have a group of 1 bedrooms, 2 bedrooms, 3 bedrooms, and 4 bedrooms, you can build 4 different sets of assumptions and know when to look. Always remember the key when building these kind of rules or benchmarks is you're trying to build something that's going to tell you when to look at something and where on the calendar to look. Because otherwise, revenue management's like kind of finding a needle in the haystack, where you're just scanning a very large tape chart to try and find an opportunity. Now I'm going to move on to, one thing I want to point out with the assumption-based stuff is I think a lot of people is the difference between booked on and stayed on revenue. A lot of us talk about sales pacing, which is a very useful way to understand if you're on pace. Did I make this much money this week? There's some differences between sales pacing and revenue pacing, though. And revenue pacing is going to be really critical for the revenue manager because it specifically tells you where to look on the calendar, and sales pacing won't always do that. And so if you look at this example here, both of these two lines are an example of sales pacing. So each week, let's say 1, 2, 3, I made this much money each week. You can see that by just looking at the sales pacing, you might be on pace. But if you actually look at where that revenue is falling, so I have this as an example saying, of this revenue that was booked, how much of it was booked to stay in the next 30 days? This can be very off pace. We're down much more in the next 30 days. And that could actually be a concern for you because that inventory is expiring. So if you're just looking at sales pacing, really good way to get an idea of how your portfolio is doing, but it won't show you the whole picture that you need to be able to make a revenue decision. Which kind of leads me into my next example, which is pickup-based revenue management. Pickup-based revenue management is a way of looking at the portfolio that shows you a number of these things all together. It's going to show you how much stayed on revenue or booked room nights you have. That's what each of these bars is. It's saying this many nights is booked for that day in the portfolio. It'll show you how recently things have sold, if done right. That's what these colors are. So on this day, there's like 23 room nights booked, and about 7 of them were booked in the last 7 days. And when you start to get used to looking at this, you can look at an entire year of your portfolio. You can see occupancy gaps clearly. You can see nights that are really, really hot. And you can start to correlate those assumptions you may have made to it. Close in, I'm almost sold out. Out here, I'm selling really fast, much faster than I would want to. Maybe I can raise the rate. And this kind of visualization is a way to be able to capture a lot of information and find exactly where you want to look on your tape chart at any given time. You're able to build this out in with a reservation list. It's a little bit difficult, but you can do so. There are platforms that will show you this data as well. I know it's very common in certain hotel things. Wheelhouse also has a version of it, which will allow you to view your portfolio in this way. The limitations of pickup-based revenue management is you do have to have that level of aggregation available. You have to have grouped your units into groups with enough similarity where you can kind of see the demand across the board. If you just look at a single unit, it's not going to be as interesting and you can't really extrapolate that information across. But if you can start to build groups of 3 to 5 or more units, you can look at this graph, see the entire calendar, and identify exactly where you need to be and compare those to your assumptions. As you fine tune them, you can start to implement more data. You can pull in market data over the top. You can compare this to your historical pacing, where we had that conversation about history not being that important. I wouldn't say it's not important. I would say it's maybe not determinative. You don't know if the history is going to repeat, but it is going to tell you something, because last year in the summer, everyone's rates were going up, booking windows were super high, you were super occupied. You may be behind pace. Even though the years aren't going to be the same, that is telling you something about what you need to do, especially if you set your rates expecting to have a higher summer than last year. So each of these techniques has pros and cons. I do think of them as not being mutually exclusive either. A comprehensive revenue strategy is really going to be using all of these. You're going to build assumptions because you need to work efficiently. You're going to use market data because, like we said, year over year trends may be different. You may not understand exactly why something has happened, and you need to triangulate some assumptions about what to do. 3, if you have access to kind of pickup based techniques, or you're able to look at that level of granularity, that's really going to be a micro way to do it. But it's not always going to apply to the things where things aren't booking, right? If you are looking way out and we're trying to extrapolate, if summer's slowing down, what's the fall, what's the winter going to be like? That pickup base may not give you that. You may need to go back all the way up to the market trends to get an idea of what's going on. So really appreciate the opportunity to chat with you guys. If you have any questions, please reach out to me, John DeRelay at usewheelhouse.com. Always happy to talk about revenue strategy with everyone. And if you're looking for some revenue management solutions, you can reach out to me or my sales team. And we do have a promotion for first-time Guesty users on Wheelhouse for the first 3 months, 50% off. You can see that there, but you can also reach out to us and ask us, or reach out to the Guesty team as well. I think they're pretty aware of it.
Thank you very much, John, for that. That was fantastic. It's great to see all these various different approaches and kind of the way that folks are actually looking at their revenue management strategies. The fact that you mentioned it's not mutually exclusive, that you have to use one strategy over the other. I think that that's a really smart approach, right? Like, why not take multiple different views through the same lens to try to see if you can kind of extract deeper understanding into your revenue management. So thank you very much for all that information. If you haven't checked out Wheelhouse, if you don't have a dynamic pricing partner yet, please go ahead, check out Wheelhouse, a great offering within the Guesty marketplace. All right, and now moving on to Robert Schweizer from Horseshoe Bay.
Thanks to Guesty for having us on, and thanks for John and John to providing some amazing information. Clearly, we all know that data is key. So what I just wanted to share is, Horseshoe Bay Living, how are we looking at things, and maybe looking at it from a practical standpoint, given sometimes the data can be quite overwhelming and you really have to have specialists on your team to be able to truly interpret it and then action that items. So real quickly about us, we try to be a vertically integrated real estate firm so we can offer a holistic solution to our guests. From the property management standpoint, again, no surprise, people talk about data, early adaptation of technology, guest and owner experience, and return on investment. Ultimately for us, we're focusing on large single-family homes, like the picture here, a 6-bedroom on the lake, with resort-style amenities in the Texas Hill Country. Because again, our view, which I'll get into in a minute, is that the experience or the industry continues to evolve, which is a good thing. And so during the pandemic, it allowed us really to take a step back and just kind of rethink what it is we're doing. And some of the key trends that, kind of solidify our long-term view is simply the following. We're really big believers that the growing penetration rate is reflecting the people obviously using the product. The pandemic helped allowing people to take rural vacations. But more importantly, the growth looks like it's going to continue, but that's dependent on growing the market, but also getting people to come back. And so for us, the stay versus experience is a theme that we talk about constantly throughout our firm. The stay represents literally the physical box that people used to stay in, and that's how we kind of view the industry, 5-10 years ago. The experience is now, especially at our trying to be at the upper end of the market, it's about providing seamless solutions for our guests using tech, but continuing with a human touch to it. And obviously, what we think is a big validator of the industry, no surprise, is the hotels. Clearly, when the hotel industry wants to move into the space, they have big revenue budgets. That's a clear validation of the industry, as well as a potential threat to their own business lines. And then lastly, but not insignificantly, financing has become more readily available. Clearly, everybody's been excited about, getting a vacation rental, using it. The financing now is making it much more accessible. So that means that the market potential is going to continue to grow, and hence the chart on the right, just showing the revenue potential. If all these things kind of align and work out, it shows that it's a pretty good place to be. So in our view, it's an interesting long-term growth market that evolves though. And so we have to be staying on top of those trends. So real quickly, what we did during the pandemic is, we heard all about the data and the pricing and the booking windows. And what we found is that our commodity properties, so typically they're smaller, and they're properties really that have no unique selling point that differentiate that property. And so, for example, dynamic pricing has always been a key staple of, say, the airline industry and the hotel industry, because candidly, those products are quite ubiquitous and people aren't really so sensitive on that profile as opposed to just getting the best price. Of course, brand is important. So what we thought was the best place for us to move in is to what we call destination properties. So what we characterize that as a minimum of 4 beds and 4 baths with resort-style amenities, specifically heated swimming pools, hot tubs, outdoor activities. And so what you can see on the right is that's allowed us in a couple of years to basically triple our ADR from just around that 300 to over 1,200 per night in the peak July and August, which for us is crucial because that's where 70% of our operating cash flow comes from. As well as, the other tangible benefits that we see is because it's destination style, if you look down at the bottom, you can see when people are making those bookings. And so that has significantly increased. Now we're a highly seasonal market. So for us, again, we're very focused on trying to lock in that summer with the best pricing return potential, and then really focusing our time on how to generate activity during the low season months. And how we kind of have been doing that is creating our own virtual front desk. We feel that this is crucial to, again, creating that amazing experience, which is not going to allow them just to have a great time, but encourage them to want to come back and tell their friends about it. So we have focused a lot on creating a 24/7 concierge team, doing private dining, open air cinema, private jet transportation, VIP wine tours, et cetera. And again, on the graph on the right, while it hasn't moved a ton, but we've seen a big jump in terms of our average stay, which then when you think about it, right, when you go back to ADR and you go back to the booking windows and you look at average stay, what we're ultimately looking at is our monthly revenues, which again has quadrupled in 2 years, from the pandemic era to today, based on the pivot that we decided to make, because what we think the industry, continues to evolve. So thinking about the tech side, obviously Wheelhouse and Transparent, they can do everything. Those guys are, tons of great data. So what are some things that the smaller teams can do that may be more relevant? So the first thing for us is, and you heard John mention it, Transparent is getting to know who your guests are. So it's guest demographics. The heat map that web key data provides is crucial to letting you know kind of where your guys are coming from, as well as then the zip code analysis that also then looks at your guest spend per stay as well. And that really allows you to fine tune your marketing to the right areas. But then more importantly, in our opinion, it's the psychographics component that we like to overlay with our demographics. So this is really the qualitative methodology of studying consumers based on what they're looking for. So again, you can see on the right, a lot of our guys are very vested in wanting to have that complete experience where they're pampered. So the chefs, the heated swimming pools, these are all services that in tune, we've then changed our marketing profile to highlight those amenities and lifestyles. And in exchange, that's allowed us to really drive our direct booking. In addition to that, you heard the two guys talk about the paid occupancy. So we're not going to spend a lot of time there, but obviously drilling down into what you've heard before, monthly seasonality. For us, the summers, March, are the key critical time period. After that, we are working on creating the demand dynamics to bring people there. Guesty does a really great job looking at the daily utilization. So if you want to look at it on an annual basis, again, for us, In December, we're a 2-day market, Friday, Saturday. In July, we're a 7-day market. So again, it's really important that we can break that down. We can forecast our holidays and events. The historical patterns, again, are important to us, especially in seasonal type markets, because it does allow us to kind of view how we're doing, what we should be doing, and where we can pivot if need be. And then obviously staying on top of new supply and the economy, because again, that's having a big impact, as we're seeing now, on occupancies. So again, then when we focus on with people like Key Data, and Guesty has a great job as well of being able to show you when your revenue is booked. Again, as the guys have already talked about, it really helps us solidify and be more secure in our summer pricing, so that again we can really focus then on trying to drive revenue opportunities that have been less predictable and less cash flow driving for us. So we can ultimately try to change our seasonality occupancy from that sort of 35 to 55, which is our goal. And then lastly, kind of just thinking how you can use all this data and input that we've talked about. And Guesty has, that revenue management. Yes, it is manual, but it does allow quite a lot of flexibility if you could drill down into it. So our strategy is that we like to partner with the dynamic pricing models. But because we have certain property profiles and amenities that I'm not sure it's completely being able to be picked up in what I think is a tool that's really great when you have a like for like comparison, we try to leverage that. And so again, what we just try to show you here is we've tried to create 85 different unique pricing rates. And then you can see the green is where we're historically almost 100% booked. The yellow, we're kind of that 60, 70, and the blue is what we call our blue ocean opportunity zone. We're really trying to attack that and create dynamic ways to bring guests to our market. And the pricing reflects so. So for example, on the Sundays, as I mentioned, we're a 2-day market. We try to discount it to pull through people to go from a 2-day stay to a 3-day stay, and try to make that rate attractive at 50%. And of course, we're updating these rates as our booking velocities and pacing are changed. But again, it just helps us to think about the granularity at a level that we can truly understand. And then ultimately, what are some tech solutions that we can use or you can use that may also help your nightly rate? Again, one thing that we've always preached is that you don't need to apologize for price when you have great quality. The great brands like the Gucci's and the Versace's and Louis Vuitton, they typically don't discount. So what we've tried to take the mentality of is, how can we create a loyalty program that really makes them want to come back and stay with us? Because we all know the benefits of direct booking. So Sasquatch is an interesting technology that you guys can use to really try to drive that loyalty program. Just give them another reason why your place is the right place through discounts, promotions, et cetera. Again, you heard us talk about psychographics. So CRM based on psychographics may be a different approach than, say, traditional demographic-based CRM technology. So what we recommend is taking a look at Freshworks. And lastly, again, the experience. You may want to consider Key Concierge to try to bundle those services within your stay, to just try to make it a little bit more competitive and interesting. So when those people are looking to make a booking, it's nice if they can have additional services without having to do the work. So guys, that's 10 minutes for us. Really appreciate Guesty having us on. Feel free to reach out to us with any questions if you just want to talk about strategy. Our contact information is here. And if you ever wanted to come out, of course, we can use our Guesty coupon code to have you come out and stay and check the experience out for yourself. So thanks, Paul. Thanks, Guesty.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, Rob. Again, I'll pitch the Horseshoe Bay Living inventory all day long and twice on Sundays. If you haven't had a chance to check it out, it's absolutely breathtaking inventory there down in Texas. Rob, I know folks showed up to hear about revenue management, but I love the psychographic element to it, right? We so often forget the premium that we can put on our revenue management strategies if we know we are a top brand with top client services, right? The whole don't apologize for price when you have a great quality product, very, very true. So this isn't just a one, your revenue management strategy isn't single threaded to just the price. It is the experience, it's the inventory, it's the quality that the guests will see from the back end of it. So thank you very much for that, Rob. A lot of really meaningful information there. And it's great to kind of see kind of the success that you can have with a more manual revenue management element. I know that based on certain inventory sizes and things, people feel almost compelled to go to and rely 100% on dynamic pricing. But you're proving out that you are able to kind of manage your own revenue management if you have access to that data and that information and you're really savvy about it.
Thanks, Paul.
Yeah. And now a little bit about our panel discussion. All right, gentlemen. So we've heard a lot about historical data and historical information. One of the key kind of concepts that was coming out of a conference that I was at in the Palm Beach area for VRMA executive was this idea that maybe it's time for our PMCs to start bringing their umbrellas. Occupancy is softening a little bit. And what we're noticing on the Guesty side, when we're looking at our reservation volumes and our occupancy trends, we're seeing slightly soft shoulders on the summer season, but still high quality kind of occupancy in the core kind of summer months. And so John Flanagan from Transparent, I wanted to ask you from a macro data perspective, what are you seeing in terms of occupancy trends? Is the macroeconomic environment having a negative impact towards occupancy, and are the glory days behind us essentially?
Yeah, it's almost a two-parter. The glory days are not behind us, but yes, occupancy is down across the board right now, significantly in some markets. What's interesting from a data perspective is that ADR remains elevated, but occupancy is down. And so in just meeting with the group internally, Robert brought up a good point earlier this week that in many cases, operators, it just costs more to run the business. And so they can't afford to drop the daily rates down lower. And then I think from a consumer perspective, what we're seeing is like there is very real fear in the markets today. People have less money that is extra to spend in many cases. So I think we're seeing that in the data from a macro perspective of occupancy being down while rates are remaining high. Whereas you might expect to see rates start to cut just to fill occupancy back up, but maybe that's not as easy to do as it has been in previous years. But the latter part, to keep this from sounding defeatist, is that no, the glory days are not behind us. We're just in a little bit of a slump.
Yeah, and thank you for that. And I, the topic of ADRs staying high but occupancy dipping a little bit was something that was talked about at that conference, and I think a lot of what our PMCs felt was increasing operational costs tied to, whether, their resources, their boots on the ground, software vendors kind of charge a little bit more due to inflation, whatever it may be. And so their hard costs are increasing, and therefore there's a break-even point of what they're willing to charge on an ADR basis. And that break-even point is a little bit higher historically for them than it was in 2019. John from Wheelhouse, same question to you. What are you guys seeing in terms of the data for this summer and potential occupancy, for the remainder of the year? Are you seeing a negative trend, or how should our PMCs kind of respond?
Well, it's funny. If you've been talking to me, I've actually been talking about this for a long time because I've been concerned about it. And I don't know if anyone caught the key data webinar yesterday where they went through a lot of macroeconomic data. And, I don't think we should phrase it as the glory days are behind us. Last year was such an unusual peak, particularly in the US, of disposable available income that, we're kind of returning to a normal trend. And I think what's been happening is I've talked to a lot of customers, and especially when we were doing onboarding and working with some of our larger customers in the spring, it was funny because you had a lot of different kinds of people. The Wheelhouse model was starting to pull down rates, and you had some people who were like, something must be wrong with the model, and they overrode it. And then you had other people who were like, yeah, I'm concerned. I'm looking at my own data. I'm a little behind pace. Looking at the market data, I think the market's behind pace. And they started pushing things out a little further. And so you get a very different thing. You get some people who've really reacted in the short term because now we solidly know that occupancy is down and a bunch of people maybe are reacting. And then there's other people who've built a base of business and approached it a little differently. And that's why it's important to kind of keep, we don't know the answer in these periods of volatility, and the volatility is not going to go away. It's going to continue to be volatile for a little while, just in a different way. And that's kind of what brings me to my idea, or one of my colleagues, Ben Coleman, if you've met him, he talks about bottom-up revenue management. And it's a great way to approach these periods of volatility is find the lowest performing properties in your portfolio and use them to do experiments further out in the booking window. Don't just assume the booking window is short. That's a dangerous thing to assume, especially as it gets shorter, because if you're wrong about what you think is going on in the market, you have very little time to react. Take your lowest stuff and start trying different strategies. Maybe everyone's holding the rate high because they felt they missed out last year and they thought it was going to be the same. If you have a hunch it's not the same, see if there's a longer booking window at a different price point and do it in your least risk units. And if you see different things happening in that like lower performing group, you can then extrapolate that into your higher performing group. Hey, do I want to take these really good units that I know are going to book and maybe bring them down a little because the market's actually showing me there is people purchasing. It's just not at the price points that we've been keeping it. So that's a good approach, I think, for dealing with this volatility. I don't know if that answered your question exactly. I do think things are softening. I don't think it's bad. And as a revenue manager, I think there's a lot of opportunities if you carve your portfolio up and do some and make some experiments, you know?
Yeah. No, I like the approach early in your answer of 2021. There was this surplus of disposable income. And so that was the anomaly year. What we're returning to is more normalcy. So it's not necessarily a down in occupancy. It's just more following traditional kind of historic trends. Topic of the webinar, I guess, historical trends. All right. So when we're talking about disposable income, Rob, I wanted to ask you the same question because I know that you've gone to more of these destination type of stay locations, probably more on the luxury side of it. Are you seeing anything on the high end of the short-term rental market falling in occupancy? Or are you still seeing a really strong summer, given the fact that your guest probably has a little bit more disposable income than your traditional traveler?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think I have to preface that we have the halo effect of Texas. And what I mean by that is, for whatever reason, everybody wants to move to our state, and we're a 4-hour driving radius within four of the top 11 MSA markets, or 5 of the top 11 MSA markets are within a 4-hour driving radius for us. So those markets continue to grow, and that's bringing in new customers. And so we're very blessed from that dynamic, that demand dynamic. We're seeing just amazing results. And obviously, everyone knows the world's richest man, Tesla, Elon Musk, has moved to Austin. And that's brought in a lot of people who just have a lot of tech money. In Austin, obviously, we have a lot of tech money. And so at the high end, basically, we just see that there's still that indifference point of spend, that they're really insulated from the general economy that most Americans or people around the world are being faced with. And so what we've seen at the high end, usually around 2,000 per night and above, we've seen both increased occupancies as well as ADRs. Conversely, at the other properties that maybe range around 500 to 700 per night, we have seen the impact there. And again, we attributed that to the big three. So new supply. I think there's a lot more vacation rentals out there than there have been in the past. The second one is obviously there's more choice, right? There's a lot more, people can now fly back to Hawaii. That didn't exist a couple of years ago. And then lastly, of course, it's the economy, right? I mean, gas and everything else is just eating into disposable incomes. And so that's having a real impact. So a couple of techniques that we always try to employ, as opposed to just discounting price, that's a last resort technique for us, because it's just that zero-sum game. If you get into a pricing war with your neighbor, you don't really end up better than you would. So a couple of ideas that we've tried to toss around that you may be able to action is by offering like in-house linen service and some other services, but they have to do a longer duration stay. And so ultimately, we're able to book more, nominal cash flow, which the owners like, less discounting, but providing value to the guests. And so again, we try to create that apples versus oranges dynamic, so it gets harder to just be a commodity-based price.
I love that approach, increasing the services element to it, bettering the guest experience, thus creating a brand ambassador or a loyalist to you for future stays. So instead of discounting price, you're just creating a better overall experience for that guest. That's a really smart approach. Rob, wanted to stay with you because we have a question from our Q&A section, which is, you had talked about kind of thinning your inventory a little bit, identifying kind of what were the premium kind of destination type of inventory, and then clearing out some of that more 1 to 2 bedroom kind of lower ANR ADR inventory for you. And so the question is, did you find that clearing out some of that lower level inventory for your business created the opportunity for you to acquire more high-end inventory, or did it increase your revenue rate strategies in any way going through that exercise?
Well, I think, there's the general answer of, you make less per stay, but there's the same amount of time, attention, and focus. And so what we want to do is we don't want to be just a large machine, a volume machine. That, being a private equity guy all my life, what I've learned is how do you blow up a great performing company? You give it growth capital. And so it's really hard to grow and scale, but yet retain that personal human touch dynamic that made you great to begin with. And so what we try to do is we try to make sure that there's alignment of interest with our owners, that the financing, that the revenue strategy is realistic. Because again, our view is that during the pandemic, you had a great performance, but that is not probably going to be how it's going to be for the next few years. And then when you look at the macro trends, there's a lot of headwinds. There's a lot of things going on in the world. So we should be making sure that we've got a real alignment. So that way, when we have to pivot and make technique differentials, we've got someone who's supporting us in doing it. So again, we don't have to give away the farm, but we can really try to focus on quality and service. And again, I think most people remember, when you go on a luxury trip, rarely do you remember the physical property. I think a lot of times you remember the people, the experience, things like that. And that's what we're trying to recreate at our properties as well.
Got it. And John, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, Robert, I really like what you're saying about realistic revenue strategy with your owners. And it brings up something that the Wheelhouse team has been talking to some folks about, and I think it's becoming more important with all this macroeconomic data. But starting to talk to your owners now about changing conditions is really important because, a lot of owners are going to be, first of all, there's always going to be someone who's going to promise they can just make you more money who's shopping for your owners. Second, a surprised owner after the fact is always going to be much more upset than an owner who's maybe been prepared a little bit. And it's a great opportunity to use that market data to kind of show like, hey, this is what we're seeing. This is what we're going to try to do, and kind of buttress up that relationship with the owner for the uncertainty that's coming. In addition to that, I've talked to a number of companies who, a lot of people bought vacation rental properties like last year based on last year's revenue. And if they're not going to be able to support that property going forward, or maybe people need to get cash and their property value is high, if you're expecting that there may be a lot of turn in owners, not in your company, but on the actual real estate side itself, start revving up your owner acquisition teams, because that means there's opportunities. There's going to be new owners in the business. There's going to be people who have different expectations of what they need to make. And that's an opportunity for you to grow your portfolio if you start now.
Yeah, that's such a valuable point about managing those owner relationships. So often it can be overlooked. You're so guest-centric that you almost forget that you have to set the right expectations and have those meaningful conversations on the owner side as well.
Yeah, Paul, we've seen a lot of that too from the transparent side. We've had a lot of requests for custom dashboards that show me versus self-managed or me versus XYZ competitors in my market, because people are revving up their owner acquisition teams and efforts. And there's a lot of owner retention efforts that are also happening.
Yeah. Great point. How do you compare versus your competitors in the market is always going to be something that you as a PNC are going to have to be able to talk to with solid revenue metrics to show for it, and revenue strategies for bolstering or actually maximizing, I should say, the revenues that you can get from that owner. John Flanagan, staying with you. At Guesty, we see a lot of mixed inventory. We see a lot of this multi-unit kind of hotel-like inventory, as well as kind of the SDR inventory. Do you see in the data that revenue strategies for urban hotel-like inventory can still be applied to short-term rental type of inventory, or is there a differentiation there of what metrics people should look at or how they're approaching their revenue strategies?
Yeah, I think from a macro perspective, we're starting to I think as a short-term rental industry, look at hotels and airlines as more almost mentors to where we should be going. And I think that the hotel industry, conversely, has started to respect the short-term rental industry as just a true competitor and not alternative accommodations necessarily as the next up-and-coming asset class. It's very real, and hotels have realized that. So, we're working on a few interesting projects with some major hotel chains that, they in specific destinations want to consider studio and one-bedroom apartments when setting their own rates for hotel rooms. And that's something that no one cared about 3 years ago. And here we are today. And it's something that, we're we're seeing often with many of the major brand.com chains globally. And I think in the same way, short-term rental owners and operators in urban markets that are competing with hotels and even in resort destinations should start to consider competitive rates against the hotel asset class. And so there's this convergence of, as I mentioned in the very beginning of my presentation, the convergence of data provisioning for both of these asset classes. And it's actually, I think, a welcomed change to our industry as short-term rentals, where we can start to actually consider the best practices that airlines and hotels have established for decades now. And it's all relevant for us now moving forward, which is a testament to the growth that we've seen as an industry over the past 10 years.
Yep. It's always interesting to see now how the big players, the hotels, the institutional kind of short-term rental operators are looking down at the STR inventory and saying, oh no, now I need to match this pricing. Where for so long, it was always the SDRs looking up at hotels and saying, all right, I want to be $50 cheaper than them so I can get the occupancy. Now it's almost a level playing field at this point.
Absolutely. I think, one thing I'll just add to this, and it wasn't part of the question, but it's interesting, I think relevant. Like we've put together an off-the-shelf product for hotels since our acquisition by OTA, because there is a ever-growing appetite in the hotel industry to consume short-term rental data. And one of these things that they're looking at, and part of the value proposition for why they should buy this data, is that there's a bunch of markets out there today that have more short-term rentals than hotel rooms. And that was something that never would have been thought of years ago.
Yeah, very good point. All right, last question for you, John, from Wheelhouse. All right, so we have PMCs on the line of all different sizes, of all various different inventory classes or listing types. At what point should a PMC start to think about having an in-house revenue management team or in-house revenue management resource? Is there the right number of listings? Is there the right, revenue being managed or owners being managed? What are you seeing being the right kind of mix of when you start professionalizing a department or a personal resource within your org to handle only revenue management?
Yeah, it's, that's a really tough question, because we all know it's really important. And quite frankly, a revenue analyst is expensive, and they're extremely hard to train. Before I was working with Wheelhouse, I was the head of revenue at a company called Stay Alfred. I saw Shane Fouts in here. He was on my team as well. And he knows that it's very difficult to build a revenue management team, especially because there's not a ton of revenue managers in the space that you can just hire from, which means you got to train people from scratch. And so we did a really good webinar with Wheelhouse about this. I'm happy to share that with you guys later. But I think there's a few things to consider. One is you should do revenue management now, even if you don't have a team member. I'm pretty sure if you're an entrepreneur of a smaller company, you're probably doing it intuitively. And for those people who are doing it intuitively, what I would recommend is start writing down and documenting the assumptions you have about your portfolio that help you make decisions. Because you cannot hire and train someone, especially maybe someone who's more of a specialist than an analyst, if you can't give them direction. And what you're going to do is either set them up to fail, or it's going to be a coin flip, or you're not going to be able to get anything off your plate, because you're going to have to look at everything they do. You probably have to do that anyway for the first 3 to 6 months. But if you document, build those assumptions in the assumption-based kind of thing, and build some ideas of you're giving them a roadmap for what to look at and when, so they can at least ask you questions about what to do. So first, even before you hire someone, document your assumptions about what you think is going on in your portfolio and your revenue. That's going to be number one. Number two, keep in mind that the functions that we have between marketing, revenue, sales, they kind of cross over. So when I started my revenue management journey 8 years ago, I was the sales director, and we did 70% of our reservations on the phone through VRBO. So I got into it because we needed to just track how much revenue we were doing. You might find someone in those groups or be able to assign some responsibilities between those groups. And as you bring on a revenue management individual, make sure they aren't siloed from your marketing manager. Because like Robert says, a lot of his revenue management strategies are very related to his marketing and his services and his sales. That's going to be true in your business. It may be very close to your distribution team who's managing your OTA stuff. It may be that person. You don't necessarily have to silo these off. that first revenue manager, or maybe maybe those people on those teams who have those responsibilities before you can actually bring on a specific specialist for it. Does that answer that question? I think that's a good place to start. If you're building a full team, I'll just share this in the chat. We talk about it with a few experienced revenue managers in the space, and you might find it kind of interesting.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much for that answer, John. I think you're exactly right. We have to view revenue management in the organization almost like a Venn diagram of sales, marketing, inventory management, and revenue management sits right there at the intersection of all three of those kind of key circles. All right. Well, thank you to our panel. Thank you, John, and Rob. You guys did a tremendous job. There's a ton or a wealth of information that we covered today. And I think our participants and our guests really got a lot out of it. So before we cut out for the day, one pitch for Guestival coming to Austin, Texas, close to Rob's neck of the woods, in September 13th to the 14th. You may see Elon Musk. If you don't, I can guarantee you'll see these diamond, platinum, gold, silver, and bronze sponsors there. So come join us, come talk to these vendors, come talk to, the Guesty folks, the product team, the customer success team. We'd love to have you for a whole slew of great agenda topics, as well as a lot of nightlife and dining and networking opportunities for you. So hopefully we'll see plenty of you guys down in Austin for this. In full transparency, seats are filling up. And so, book today to guarantee your spot. Thank you everyone for attending. Thank you to our panelists. If you have any questions, let us know. This meeting is being recorded and will be shared on Guesty socials. And everyone have a great rest of your day, wherever you are in the world.